experience. There is a moment people rarely notice, especially when it comes to an empath. From the outside, everything looks the same. Experience. The empath is still listening, still showing up, still extending patience and understanding. They still answer messages, still soften their tone. Experience. Still give the benefit of the doubt. And because nothing appears broken on the surface, experience, no one realizes that something fundamental has already shifted underneath. The breaking point for an empath is almost never loud. It doesn't arrive with slammed doors or dramatic declarations. It arrives quietly after one too many moments of feeling unseen. Experience. An empath doesn't detach the first time they're hurt, or the second, or even the third. They explain things away. Experience. They tell themselves that people are stressed, distracted, doing the best they can. They search for context, for history, experience, for reasons that make the pain easier to carry. Empaths are exceptionally skilled at reframing discomfort into compassion. Experience. They assume responsibility not just for their own emotions, but for the emotional weight of everyone around them. And because of that, experience, they stay long past the point where others would have left. What pushes an empath toward detachment isn't a single act of cruelty, experience, but a pattern of dismissal. It's the repeated experience of speaking honestly and feeling unheard, of expressing needs and watching them be minimized, of offering emotional depth and receiving surface level effort in return. Over time, those moments stack up not as anger but as fatigue, a quiet experience, accumulating exhaustion that settles into the body before it ever reaches the mind. This is the part most people misunderstand. Experience. They assume that if an empath is still present, then everything must be okay. But presence doesn't always mean connection. Often, experience, by the time an empath begins to pull away, they've already spent months, sometimes years, fighting internally to stay. Experience. They've already tried different versions of themselves, more patient, more flexible. Experience. More forgiving, hoping one of those versions would finally be enough to be met halfway. Experience. The breaking point comes when the empath realizes they are the only one adjusting, when they recognize that their effort has become expected, appreciated, that their emotional labor is no longer a gift but an obligation. And in that realization, something soft but decisive happens. The empath stops explaining, stops reminding, stops asking, not because they don't care, experience, but because they finally see that caring alone cannot create mutual respect. This moment is deeply internal. There's no announcement, no ultimate experience, just a subtle shift in energy. The empath begins to observe instead of engage. They notice how often they're the one initiating connection. Experience. How often they're the one repairing tension. How often their kindness fills the space where accountability should be. And once they see it clearly, experience, they can't unsee it. What makes this breaking point so silent is that it's rooted in clarity, not chaos. Experience. The empath doesn't detach in rage or resentment. They detach when they understand the cost of staying. Experience. They realize that continuously offering empathy in an environment that doesn't honor it slowly erodes their sense of self. Experience. And for someone who feels deeply, that erosion is more frightening than loss. At this stage, others may still believe there's time. Experience. They may think a conversation, an apology, or a sudden change in effort can fix things, but they don't realize that the empath has already grieved. Experience. The grief didn't happen at the end, it happened quietly while the empath was still present. By the time detachment becomes visible, experience, the emotional decision has already been made. This is why when an empath finally steps back, it feels sudden to everyone else. But for the empath, experience, it's overdue. It's the result of listening too long without being heard, of loving too deeply without being met. Experience. Of staying loyal to connections that stopped being safe for their emotional well-being. Detachment at this point isn't an act of abandonment. Experience. It's an act of self-recognition. After that quiet breaking point, something subtle but powerful takes place. The empath doesn't storm out, experience, doesn't raise their voice, doesn't demand to be understood one last time. Instead, they grow quieter, and this silence is often misunderstood. Experience. People assume it's passive aggression, punishment, or emotional withdrawal meant to provoke guilt. But that assumption misses the truth entirely. experience. The silence of an empath is not designed to hurt anyone else. It is designed to stop hurting themselves. For a long time, experience, the empath believed that communication could fix everything if they explained their feelings clearly enough, kindly enough, patiently enough, experience. Then surely they would be heard. They learned to soften their words, to choose timing carefully, to prioritize peace over being right, experience. They spoke in ways meant to be received, not just expressed. And yet, over time, they noticed a painful pattern, experience. Their words were acknowledged but not honored, listened to but not acted upon, experience. Silence begins the moment the empath understands that continuing to speak without being met is a form of self-betrayal, experience. It's the realization that explaining your pain to someone who consistently dismisses it only deepens the wound. At some point, experience, the empath recognizes that their voice has been turned into background noise, and no amount of repetition will suddenly make it meaningful, experience. So they stop explaining, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Silence becomes a boundary where words once failed, experience. It's the empath choosing not to bleed emotionally in spaces that refuse to hold that vulnerability with care. This silence isn't empty, experience. It's full of discernment. It's filled with everything the empath finally understands about what they can and cannot control, experience. What's important to grasp here is that silence costs the empath something. They don't enjoy withdrawing. Expression is natural to them, experience. Connection is their instinct. So when they choose quiet, experience, it's not because they've stopped feeling. It's because they feel too much to keep offering themselves without protection, experience. Silence is the last place they retreat to when openness has been exhausted. Others may notice the change and feel unsettled by it, experience. The empath no longer fills gaps in conversation. They no longer smooth over tension or rush to repair discomfort, experience. They no longer over-explain their intentions or apologize for emotions that are valid, and that absence of emotional labor can feel like distance, experience. Even coldness to those who benefited from it without recognizing its cost. But internally, the empath is finally regulating their energy, experience. They are learning to sit with their feelings without immediately translating them for someone else's understanding. Silence gives them space to observe instead of absorb, to reflect instead of react, experience. It creates a pause where the empath can ask themselves an essential question: is this connection safe for me, or am I shrinking to sustain it, experience? This kind of silence also serves as a mirror. When the empath stops over functioning emotionally, the true dynamics of the relationship become visible, experience. Who reaches out when the empath doesn't? Who notices the shift, who takes responsibility, and who simply waits for things to go back to how they were, experience. Silence reveals truths that words often cover up. And here's the part that makes this silence permanent. The empath begins to feel peace in it, loneliness, not bitterness, but relief. The nervous system settles. The constant internal dialogue quiets, experience. The empath realizes that they don't need to be understood by everyone to be whole, experience. They don't need to prove their depth to people who skim the surface. Silence becomes not just protection, but clarity. At this stage, experience, returning to the old pattern feels impossible. The empath can't unlearn what silence has taught them, experience. They've discovered that their worth isn't dependent on how much they give, explain, or endure. And once that awareness takes root, experience, speaking again without change would feel like stepping back into a smaller version of themselves. By the time an empath reaches this stage, the exhaustion they carry is not obvious, but it is profound. From the outside, they may still appear calm, kind, even emotionally steady. But inside, experience, there is awareness that comes from carrying far more than their share for far too long. Empaths don't just feel their own emotions, they absorb the emotional atmosphere of every room they enter. They notice shifts in tone, unspoken tension, discomfort others try to hide, experience. And without being asked, they respond to it. They soothe, they reassure, they stabilize, they make things easier for everyone else, experience, often without realizing how much of themselves it costs. This emotional labor becomes second nature. The empath is the one who listens deeply, experience, who remembers details, who senses when something is wrong before a word is spoken. They hold space for anger they didn't cause, experience, sadness they didn't create, and confusion they didn't invite. And they do it willingly because empathy at its core is an act of love experience. But love without balance slowly turns into depletion. What drains an empath isn't intensity, it's inconsistency. They can handle deep emotions, experience. They can sit with pain. What wears them down is being the only one doing so. Over time, experience, they notice that they are the emotional container while others are simply pouring into them. They are the ones adapting, understanding, forgiving, experience, while their own needs are postponed, minimized, or forgotten entirely. At first, they don't complain. In fact, experience. They often don't even recognize what's happening. They tell themselves this is just who they are, experience. They convince themselves that being strong means being accommodating, that being loving means enduring discomfort quietly, experience. And because they're good at managing emotions, no one questions whether they should have to experience. But emotional exhaustion doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up as numbness where warmth used to be, experience, as hesitation where openness once flowed freely. The empath starts feeling tired not just in their body, but in their spirit, experience. Conversations feel heavier, giving feels obligatory instead of genuine. Even joy starts to require effort. This is the moment where empathy, experience, once a strength, begins to feel like a burden, not because the empath has changed, experience, but because the environment around them has relied on that empathy without replenishing it. They've been strong for too long without support, experience. Available without appreciation, understanding without reciprocity. And here's the hardest truth for an empath to accept, experience. Love does not require self-erasure. Care does not mean self-neglect. But until this realization takes hold, they continue pushing past their limits, experience, hoping things will eventually even out. They believe that if they just give a little more, explain a little better, hold on a little longer, experience, balance will return. Instead, the exhaustion deepens. The empath begins to feel invisible, not because no one sees them, experience, but because no one truly considers them. Their inner world becomes crowded with unprocessed feelings, while their outer world keeps demanding calm and compassion. That imbalance creates a quiet resentment, not toward others, experience, but toward themselves for allowing it to continue. Detachment begins here not as a choice, but as a necessity, experience. The empath system simply cannot keep absorbing without release. Their mind and body signal that something has to change. And slowly, experience, almost imperceptibly, they begin to pull their energy inward. They stop volunteering their emotional labor. They stop preemptively fixing things, experience. They conserve. This shift can feel unsettling at first. The empath may experience guilt for not showing up the way they used to, experience. They may question whether they're becoming selfish or distant. But beneath that doubt is an emerging truth: they are finally listening to themselves, experience. Emotional exhaustion teaches the empath a lesson that words never could. It teaches them that empathy without boundaries is unsustainable, experience. That constantly prioritizing others while abandoning yourself leads not to connection, but to collapse. And once this lesson is learned, experience, it cannot be unlearned. At some point, after the exhaustion settles in and the silence has created space, a different kind of awareness begins to form, experience. This is not an emotional realization, but an intellectual and emotional alignment that brings clarity, experience. The empath starts to see their situation without the haze of hope that once softened every disappointment. For a long time, experience, hope was what kept them invested. Hope that if they loved harder, communicated better, or waited longer, things would eventually shift, experience. Hope made imbalance feel temporary, but understanding changes everything. Understanding doesn't arrive suddenly. It unfolds slowly, in moments of reflection where the empath notices how little actually changes despite how much they give, experience. They replay conversations and recognize patterns instead of isolated incidents. They realize they've been responding to potential rather than reality, experience, to who someone could be rather than who they consistently are. And that distinction is sobering. This is the moment where hope loses its grip, experience. Not because the empath becomes cynical, but because they become honest. They acknowledge that love alone cannot create accountability, experience. That empathy cannot replace effort. That understanding someone's pain does not excuse repeated harm or neglect. This realization isn't bitter experience, it's grounding. For an empath, this shift can feel almost disorienting experience. They've spent so long leading with compassion that stepping back into objectivity feels unfamiliar. But once they do experience, they begin to ask different questions. Experience. Not, how can I make this work? But why am I the only one trying? Not, what more can I give? But what am I losing by staying? Understanding also brings responsibility. Experience. The empath recognizes that staying in a dynamic that consistently drains them is a choice, and that awareness can be uncomfortable experience because it removes the illusion that they are simply enduring circumstances beyond their control. They see where they have overextended, overexplained experience and overaccommodated, not out of weakness, but out of a deep desire to preserve connection. This is where detachment becomes inevitable experience. Once the empath understands the true nature of the imbalance, they can no longer participate in it without betraying themselves. Experience. They don't detach because they stop caring. They detach because they start caring differently. They care about their own emotional integrity. Experience. What makes this moment so powerful is its calmness. There's no emotional explosion, no dramatic confrontation. Experience. Just a quiet decision rooted in self-respect. The empath stops negotiating with themselves. They stop rationalizing behavior that hurts. They stop making excuses for patterns that persist. Understanding also dissolves fantasy experience. The empath lets go of the imagined future where everything finally aligns. They release the version of the relationship that exists only in their hope. Experience. This grief is real, but it's clean. It's not tangled with denial or bargaining. It's the grief of acceptance. And with acceptance comes peace experience. Not the kind that feels euphoric, but the kind that feels steady. The empath realizes that clarity is kinder than false hope, that knowing the truth experience, even when it's painful, is less damaging than endlessly waiting for change that never arrives. This is the point of no return experience. Because once understanding replaces hope, the empath cannot go back to investing blindly. They see themselves clearly now. They see the cost of staying experience, and they see the strength it takes to choose differently. Detachment at this stage isn't reactive, it's resolved. It's not a defense mechanism experience, but a conscious boundary. The empath steps back not to punish, but to protect what remains of their energy and sense of self experience. By the time an empath reaches this stage, detachment has already been misunderstood by those on the outside. It's often labeled as coldness experience. Indifference or emotional shutdown. People say the empath has changed, that they've become distant or hard experience. But what's actually happened is far more nuanced. The empath hasn't lost their capacity to feel experience. They've simply stopped offering themselves in places where their presence required self-sacrifice. Detachment is not the absence of care experience. It is the redefining of it. The empath still feels deeply, but they no longer allow that depth to be exploited. Where they once rushed to fix, soothe, and accommodate, they now pause. Where they once absorbed blame or confusion, they now let responsibility land where it belongs. This isn't cruelty experience, it's clarity. For an empath, this shift can feel unsettling at first. Their identity has long been tied to being emotionally available, supportive, experience understanding. Stepping back may trigger guilt. They may worry that protecting themselves makes them unkind or selfish. But over time, experience, they begin to see that what they've done isn't withdrawal, it's completion. They've given all they can give. Experience. Closure for an empath rarely comes from apologies or explanations. It comes from acceptance. Experience. Acceptance that some people will never meet them at the depth they offer. Acceptance that being needed is not the same as being valued. Experience. Acceptance that love without reciprocity eventually becomes harm. This is where detachment becomes final experience. And not because the empath wants to erase the connection, but because they've resolved it internally. They no longer need validation, acknowledgement, experience, or understanding from the other side to move forward. They've already done the emotional processing. They've already grieved what could have been experience. And this is why there is no return. When an empath detaches at this level, it's not a temporary boundary meant to create change experience. It's a conclusion drawn from lived experience. They have seen the pattern clearly. They have honored their feelings fully experience. There is nothing left to negotiate. What looks like coldness from the outside is actually self-containment experience. The empath is no longer leaking energy into situations that drain them. Experience. They're no longer overextending to maintain connections that cost more than they give. Experience. They've learned that peace doesn't come from fixing everything, but from knowing when to stop trying. This detachment is quiet and respectful experience. There's no need for confrontation because the empath has already made peace with the truth. They don't seek revenge or recognition experience. They simply move differently. Their emotional doors close softly, without resentment, without bitterness. And in that closure, something profound happens. The empath begins to return to themselves. Energy, once spent managing others, becomes available for healing, creativity, experience, and rest. Emotional space opens up. The nervous system settles. Life feels lighter, not because it's easier, experience, but because it's no longer burdened by imbalance. This stage is often mistaken for emotional numbness, but it's the opposite experience. The empath is finally feeling themselves again. They laugh without effort. They breathe without tension. They engage without overthinking experience. Detachment has cleared the emotional noise that once drowned out their own inner voice. Closure for an empath doesn't require final words experience. It requires internal alignment. When their actions finally match their self-respect, the chapter closes naturally. There's no need to revisit it, experience, explain it, or reopen it. What follows detachment is not emptiness, as many expect, but a quiet kind of strength that doesn't ask to be seen. Experience. The empath doesn't walk away triumphantly or with bitterness trailing behind them. They walk away calmly. Experience, carrying a sense of peace that feels unfamiliar at first. For so long, their energy was tied to managing emotions, maintaining balance, experience, and holding connections together. Now, with that weight set down, there is space. And in that space, something powerful begins to take shape. Experience. Walking away is often mistaken for weakness or avoidance. But for an empath, it is one of the most deliberate acts of courage they can make. Experience. They are choosing uncertainty over familiar pain. They are choosing self-trust over approval. And that choice doesn't need an audience. Experience. It doesn't need justification. It stands on its own. The quiet power of this moment lies in its restraint. Experience. The empath doesn't need to explain themselves repeatedly or convince anyone of their reasons. They've already done the work internally. Experience. They understand what they endured, what they offered, and why leaving was necessary. That understanding becomes their anchor. As they step forward, experience, they notice changes that once felt impossible. Their thoughts are clearer, their reactions are calmer. The constant emotional vigilance fades. Experience. They're no longer scanning for shifts in mood or tension. They're no longer anticipating needs that aren't theirs to carry. Experience. Life begins to feel more spacious. This piece isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. Experience. It arrives in small moments. A deep breath that comes easily, a laugh that feels unforced, a decision made without second guessing. Experience. The empath realizes that they're no longer performing emotional labor for survival. They're simply being. Experience. There is also a reclaiming that happens here. The empath starts reconnecting with parts of themselves that were set aside to accommodate others. Experience. Creativity returns. Curiosity resurfaces. Rest no longer feels like something they have to earn. Experience. They begin to live from alignment rather than obligation. Importantly, this piece doesn't require the past to be invalidated. Experience. The empath doesn't rewrite history to justify their departure. They can honor what was real without allowing it to define what comes next. Experience. This is maturity, not detachment from feeling, but integration of it. Experience. Others may only realize the empath is gone when they notice the absence of emotional support they once relied on. But by then, experience, it's not a loss the empath feels compelled to repair. They understand that being missed is not the same as being valued, experience. And they no longer need either to move forward. The quiet power of walking away is that it doesn't seek revenge. It doesn't linger. experience. It doesn't hover in expectation, it simply continues experience. The empath learns that the most meaningful boundaries are the ones that don't need enforcement because they are upheld by self-respect. Experience. This stage is not about closing off to the world. In fact, the empath becomes more selective, not less open. Experience. They choose connections where empathy flows both ways, where care is mutual, not extracted, where presence doesn't require self-erasure. Experience. And in this final shift, the empath understands something deeply liberating. Peace is not found in being needed, but in being whole. Experience. They no longer chase understanding from those who couldn't offer it. They no longer pour energy into places that cannot hold it.